Hello.
Hi there.
Uh, Welcome, Deb. Deb Kolodny is a longtime comrade of mine. We met about 25 years ago at a bisexual conference where they gave a workshop on bisexual women and the threat to lesbian feminism. And I just always remember Deb's brilliant insights, and they've been going on to do all kinds of amazing things. Deb is a rabbi. Deb was very active in the Black Lives Matter movement in Portland, including in 2020 when things were very intense. And Deb has now moved to Massachusetts where things are, for the moment, a little bit calmer. And is there anything else that you'd like to say about yourself to
Mm,
let our viewers know who you are?
I'm just really delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful, wonderful. So the first question is, what is the connection between being a rabbi and being a social justice activist?
Mm. Great question. I think I'm going to go back to my to my youth when I was raised by parents who were decidedly Jewish, but not at all religious or observant. And for them, living Judaism meant that you were a justice seeker, without even knowing that our Torah says tzedek tzedek tirdof. Really, you need to pursue justice. This is a major mitzvah or commandment or obligation in for our people. They were just raised in a zeitgeist where if there was a wrong, my mother was like, write a letter, or if there was a protest, you went and marched. We also had a deep, deep background in the labor movement. So my father was part of a teacher and he was part of the union. And yeah, so I just grew up in this context where it was, I guess, in the water I drank, right? And
Mhm,
it was how I was schooled at home. So that's one piece. It's a cultural norm in Judaism. And then the what propelled me to go to seminary in mid-career as a middle-aged person was I was supporting the national. It was then called the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. Now the task force, their religious leadership roundtable, which was
mhm.
a group of representatives from different religious traditions that were called welcoming. So if um, I'm not dignity, for example, is the Catholic representation, and more light Presbyterians, but the arms of each of the traditions that was supportive of the LGBTQI inclusion and celebration, and many Jewish streams were there. And I was not yet ordained. I was facilitating the group and supporting their strategic planning and supporting their organizing. I loved this work. It was my favorite client at the time I was doing consulting, and it was absolutely clear to me every time we organized a press conference that I would not get to speak, even though I was staff, because it was the ordained clergy who got to speak because that was who the press wanted to
Where's
hear.
you from? Yeah.
And you hear the phrase bully pulpit, so that people who are not ordained, but they have a public forum to speak and help create change. This was actually, I guess kind of a real pulpit. And I felt propelled to go to seminary in part because I was so driven at that point in my life, by that point in my life, by my spiritual convictions and my religious convictions. And I wanted to give voice to them with authority, and with some
Mhm.
credentialing and some sense of, yeah, some sense of, I know what I'm talking about. So it, it propelled me to
And
go.
so activism led you to become a rabbi, is part of
Exactly,
what I'm hearing.
exactly, exactly. And then once ordained, I moved to Portland, Oregon, right after I was ordained for my first pulpit, and I moved into a community that was very, very justice oriented, and so there was a Tikkun Olam committee. Tikkun Olam means repairing the world. So it was their social justice committee, very, very active. But their flavor of activism was really, oh, let's bring in this person to teach us this, or let's hear about this exciting activity that's going on in Israel Palestine for self-determination for Palestinians and human rights. And but it's all this learning, 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 which I was like, fine, that's a great first step, but let's like do.
As
But
well.
it really
Yeah.
wasn't their way. And so I went to seminary to be an activist rabbi, and I was a little constrained in my first pulpit. um And I left there a little bit after I'd been there for 3 years. There were a lot of reasons why it wasn't a fit. I started my own thing, and pretty soon after I started my own community, the campaign Trump was on the campaign trail and was just spewing this hateful rhetoric, which gave permission and invitation, if not instigation, to haters
Yeah.
to come out and do their thing. And it turned out, I did not know this when I moved to Oregon, that Oregon had been founded as a white state,
Yeah.
that there were huge numbers of white nationalists living there, and because it had unbelievably lax gun control laws, those folks had automatic weapons and they could openly carry them in public spaces. And since I was then doing my own thing and I had really founded my community to be a justice seeking community, it was part of the mission. I was totally liberated to go out into the streets and both at counter rallies when the white nationalists would come into town, they had a monthly schedule,
Mhm.
and then when the Black Lives Matter uprising started after the George Floyd murder. So I was in the streets both just as a I was gonna say Jew in the streets, like a Jew in the pew, right? You know, just being part of the minions, lending my body and my voice, and I was out in the streets frequently speaking, and being invited to speak because true to my instinct, clergy people are desired as public speakers to, give power and authority to why justice is the right thing.
Mhm. Mhm. That's fascinating. Thank you. And how did, like, why Black Lives Matter? What did you, and yeah, what drew you to that movement in particular?
Yeah. Well, I was drawn to it immediately when the movement first emerged, which I think was around 2013,
I think it
14.
was 13. Yeah.
Yeah. But I didn't quite know how to engage. But I was blessed in that time to be running Neharim, which was a national Jewish retreat and advocacy organization. And um, I saw an opportunity to um, take action at the intersection of those two pieces, advocacy and retreat, and launch a retreat for queer clergy of all denominations, not just Jews, of all faith practices, to support Black Lives Matter. So
Mhm.
I was blessed just to be in this position where I could imagine a way to put to pray with my feet, and to take action on something that I really believed in. And so I co-created the event with my dear friend who's now passed, Sheikh Ibrahim Baba. Ibrahim Farjaje Jones was how I first met him in
Yeah, me
Washington,
too.
D.C. We did bi-activism together when he was at Howard, teaching at Howard in their divinity school. And he was a Russian Orthodox priest at the time. And by the time this next iteration of his activism and spirituality came around, he was a Sufi sheikh and also an observant Jew.
Wow.
So the two of us organized this conference, and I connected with all the local activists in Portland. There were a couple of different Black Lives Matter organizations. One was called Don't Shoot Portland, and we designed this event so that we would not come together as mixed race people, imagining what we could do, but we would be um, informed by local activists. Like, this is what we're doing on the ground. This is how faith activists can support us. So
Mm.
whether that was raising money for their work or showing up at their called events, or if they needed folks to testify for a certain piece of legislation, or just we would just be at their service. That was basically the model, right? um so again, I was able to manifest this vision of, what can clergy do? We can lend our voice and our authority to something that's important. So yeah, so that it was yeah, such an amazing blessing. And I keep using the past tense to refer to Ibrahim Baba because he sadly passed in 2016. 16, in February
Mm.
of 2016, when he was in his 60s. I mean, I consider his death to be a casualty of racism. The stress, environmental illness. He had asthma. And anyway, so it was a beautiful thing over 30 years to partner with him. And yeah, and that's how that unfolded.
So I just want to share your story of bringing together retreat and activism. That's actually how I started Conversations Against Fascism. My first event was a retreat for my 50th birthday party, which was in 2020,
Mm.
and we really looked at what's going on in the world and what we're not facing. Um, and I quickly discovered that we couldn't do action planning because we were not an interdependent system. So you were several steps ahead of us on that.
Mm.
And now when I do retreats, I make sure um, that the people in the room are people who will have an opportunity to work together in the future.
Right. And I want to say that this was a, a challenge, a structural challenge for that particular retreat, the Queer Clergy for Black Lives Matter, because it was a national event.
Oh.
But what we did was we had a big a core of folks from the Portland area who were an intact system or could easily create one. And then we had the folks from around the country organize themselves into, okay, if you are working at a seminary or an educational institution, so like what like-minded strategies might you be able to bring home with you? Or if you're congregational, what like-minded strategies might you bring home to your folks? I'm trying to remember if there was another category. Am I community service, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you're right, being an intact community makes all the difference. Makes all the difference.
Yeah. And so when we spoke before, you were talking about like what you see as a world without, I don't know if a world without policing or a world without destructive policing. What tell us about your vision.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, it was a long time coming. I am a lawyer, and when I went to law school, and I, in the 1980s, I had no idea of the history of policing. I had no idea of how it was designed to support white supremacy and slavery. The first police forces were created to find and return slaves who had run away from their the plantations where they were chattel, and were also used to union bust. So I had no idea of that history, and it wasn't until the Black Lives Matter movement emerged and started confronting the horrors of policing that I started taking a deeper look.
Mm.
And I want to recommend to everybody that you read the book by a gentleman named Vitali. I'm forgetting his first name in this moment, called The End of Policing. Because by the time I read it, I had learned everything he was saying, but it encapsulates all the reasons that policing as we know it today needs to be dismantled. And I will just give an overview now. Um, over the last 30 years, 40 years, it wasn't the police leadership that did this. Voters did this. We voted in elected politicians who grotesquely expanded the role of the police. So the war on drugs did that by criminalizing drug use and not just cartels. The war on sex workers did this by criminalizing individual sex workers and not folks who were doing sex trafficking. Um, Something called broken windows policing did this by basically making it a crime to be poor or have, you can be pulled over if you've got a tail light out, and then if you are driving while black, you're exposed to police officers who work in a totally militarized environment, which is the next piece. Police are using weapons from the military, especially for crowd control. They have tanks, they're using flashbangs, which are devices used to flush people out of caves and other mm, difficult to enter or dangerous to enter places and war zones, not to mention the use of tear gas, which is a known abortifactant. It's unbelievable. So the militarization is out of control. And then the incredible expansion of police, like they're doing domestic uh, uh, disturbance or domestic abuse calls, and they're not trained as social workers. They're not trained to de-escalate. So there's been this grotesque expansion, and police forces are unbelievably bloated. And when looking at the question, like, should police exist? When we think, oh, well, we want them to stop crime, the number of crimes that are interrupted and stopped is, like, minuscule, like 0.01% or something. It's ridiculous. So what our fantasy is of what we see on police TV, right, shows never ever happens.
Mhm.
And, so the first thing I think folks really need to be made aware of is, for the most part, police are not making us safer. For the most part, they are, um, making things more dangerous for us, as we can see by the incredibly disproportionate number of Black, especially Black men, who are shot and killed when they are unarmed, when they are fleeing, which means they're shot in the back. So we have this racist, bloated system where police are also they're asked to do things they should not be asked to do. So do I think police should not exist at all? That is my belief. I think we can. The phrase is keep ourselves safe, keep each other safe, right? By creating systems where there are first responders who are not armed, so whether it's EMTs or social workers, or whether there are systems for preventing lifestyle crimes. In Portland, Oregon, I'm just going to keep using Portland as an example because that's where I did most of my activism. 50% of the criminal activity were people who are homeless, and they
Mm.
were engaging in lifestyle. Um,
Like
in
peeing
fact,
in public or
correct, peeing in public, bathing in a public fountain, um, pitching a tent on public grounds that are not, campgrounds. 50%. So right there, 50% of the police budget should be just abolished, as far as I'm concerned. Use that money to build homes, to build housing, for people who need it. I mean, it's absurd, right?
Mhm.
Because I was an activist in this sphere, I was part of lots of conversations with the police. I got this data, I wasn't the only one who got it, that unpacked how police were using their time.
Mm.
13% of police time was used actually on addressing criminal activity. All the rest was like traffic stops or this lifestyle infraction or domestic disputes. 13% of police time was spent on criminal activity, where they were not solving crimes for the vast majority of that time.
Right.
So right there, I have to tell you, 87% of the police budget should be cut. They're not even doing
They're not even doing what they say they're doing.
yeah, or what we think is important about what they're doing. So, yeah. So I think that the system can't be reformed. I will say I spent some time in conversations looking at the potential for reform, and I became convinced that reform was not possible. So, should there be some kind of armed force that's not militarized that can be brought in, maybe to address a hostage situation? I think I could live with that.
Right, a mass shooting situation, exactly. It's
Yeah.
the one time that I've been grateful for police. It's ironic, not well, it is ironic. So I lived in a small town outside of Pittsburgh where there was a big gang violence problem among the children. And I was like half a block from a shooting. And then there were a lot of police cars going by, and my roommate said, something disparaging about the police. And I'm like, well, there was just a shooting. And then minutes after that, they killed a young boy. You might have heard about it, Antoine Rose, um, who was running away.
Yeah.
And nobody, no one was seriously injured in the original shooting.
it's tragic and it's horrifying. And the other thing I want to say is when you look at how the police in most every city address protesters, unarmed, First Amendment protected, free speech protected protesters who are largely like 98%, like middle class, middle aged people, which is what was happening in the streets of Portland, right? Um, how the police riot in response to those kinds of angry protesters. Yes, horrible things are happening. We're angry, right? But there's no risk, there's no threat, there's no violence. Maybe somebody throws a plastic water bottle over a fence barricade into an empty uh, plaza. I say that because I saw that with my own eyes, right?
Yep.
Somebody threw a water bottle that was half empty. There was no one near them, and the tear gas started, and a riot was called. So police are supposedly trained in de-escalation, and yet they escalate,
They
right?
escalate, yeah.
50 years of research that was sponsored by the Department of Justice, that proved that de-escalation works. De-escalation, which is just verbal discussion with folks, right? Um, and that all of the technologies and all of the tactics of police escalate. So, um, yeah, so it's on every realm, on the day-to-day policing, on the extreme moment policing, whatever you want to call it, um, they're failing. And compare that to you're in a psych ward and somebody who's having a mental health crisis is violent. Nurses, without any weapons, de-escalate that actually violent person so that they and the nurses are safe and the patient is safe and everybody on the floor is safe. So I say, if something untoward is happening in the street, send out the nurses.
Well, yeah, I had a pretty terrible experience with a nurse once. But
Mhm.
but what this shows is that people can be trained to de-escalate
Yes,
without violence consistently, to
absolutely.
bring order to a situation without violence.
And I remember because when I was in my year and a half of exploring whether reform was possible, I did because that's how I am. So I researched and I found out that in Salt Lake City, they had experienced 2 years without any fatal shootings by the police. And they had a strategy for teaching their officers de-escalation, which was very martial arts oriented. Because I'm a martial artist, I was like, "Oh, this is brilliant!" Right? So they found that when if the police officer stepped away, then the person with the gun, this is with armed folks, would come towards them and be a little off kilter, like they would be off balance. And then if another officer went around to the back, they could disarm the person because they were off balance and they were focused on the officer in front of them. Very like jujitsu, right?
Yeah.
2 years, they had no fatal shooting. Now, after that, they did, but that was a good record for a police force of that size. So I'm like, all right,
Yeah. I have
and
a I have my thoughts about Utah and the Mormons. Some very interesting social policies, or I don't like their ideology, but the way that they create community is very interesting.
mhm.
And speaking of creating community, I know you wanted to share about experiences with mutual aid in
Mm,
these in the streets movements.
yeah. I'll tell you, especially since the uprising took place during COVID, when there was so much fear and people were social distancing and social isolating. Um, when we started going in the streets, everyone was masked. There was such incredible health discipline. And younger people who were in the streets were walking around with these, hand sanitizer bottles and say, "Would you like some hand sanitizer? Would you like some hand sanitizer?" So freaking adorable. And not a single person I knew ever got sick in the street. So that was the first thing. We were taking care of each other's health and well-being, and we took it so seriously. Little villages arose, which reminded me of Occupy, and there would be food, barbecue, and there would be clothing swaps, and there would be the medics who were there to support the protesters in case or when the police started rioting against us. The medics would provide assistance to people who needed the kind of health care that they were equipped to provide. And in these it was messy. It was so messy, and it was dirty, and it was glorious. It was glorious. I might start to get emotional here.
Hmm.
And I felt like in the moment we were creating the world we wanted to
World we
see.
want to live in. Yeah. I had the same experience in Occupy. I could also cry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
It's awesome.
and those and the mutual aid went beyond the streets, so Facebook pages would arise. This is so and so needs food, so and so needs furniture, so and so needs this. One of my congregants worked at a hotel, and at certain points they release their linens, and they buy new ones, right? And whatever she would say periodically get to me, I have boxes ready. Can you get them where they need to go? And so the larger community, it wasn't just those who were there at the protests, were there to support one another. Um, there were protesters who were being surveilled and stalked by police
Mhm.
for their protest activity. And I was involved in finding safe places for them to stay to create some kind of yeah,
Protection.
yeah. It wasn't. I wouldn't say an underground railroad. It wasn't like quite that, but yeah, protection. For sanctuary, sanctuary.
Sanctuary.
Yeah,
Wow. It's really beautiful.
yeah. So beautiful things were happening, and at a time when everybody was separating from each other. I miss this. I miss how connected we were, and how brave and smart we were.
Yeah. Which I guess the last question is what's next, Deb?
Mm. That's a great question because, as you mentioned, I'm now in Massachusetts. I'm in Amherst, and it's a different world here. The I guess the week that we arrived, which was last July, in the local newspaper, was the ebullient celebratory headline that a reparations bill had been passed by the town council, and now there is a committee made up of African American folks who are deciding, like, where's the money going to come from, and what is the process going to be for distribution of funds to those who are impacted by slavery. And I was like, wow, what a difference, what a difference. And Northampton is in the process of pursuing such a resolution in its
Well,
city. And here in Amherst it only impacts African Americans, Black people, and not Indigenous people, so that's the next stop. Yeah, so I'm in a different world, and it's taking some getting used to. I hated the streets. I hated being between the crosshairs of the armed white nationalists and the fascist police, and I miss the streets. um, so I'm looking to see. I think there's one thing I'm really have become very clear about is Western Mass does not have self-awareness about the fact that it is a climate refuge. And
mm,
in terms of climate catastrophe, our prognosis here is very good. And when the sea starts encroaching on the land, and when the southern states become hotter and hotter and hotter, this is an area that's going to see considerable growth. And there is no planning going on around
mm,
housing security, food security, transportation, connectivity, to be able to accommodate that influx. And so I've started actually having conversations with folks about that. So that might be one place where I invest some time. I'm also shocked to find out that Massachusetts, with its spectacular gun control laws and its spectacular bodily autonomy laws around a person with a uterus's right to choose, does not have a death with dignity law at this point, and that's another passion of mine that people should be able to say when their life is over, and be supported so that they can have a good end.
Mm, amazing.
So we'll see. We'll see. I'm still in process.
And I actually don't remember, are you offering our participants a free gift?
Oh, thank you. I don't have what to give, but, I would be thrilled for you to put out my email address and for folks to get in touch with me. So maybe a gift could be if you want some consultation on any of the things we've talked about, I'm happy to offer my time.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Deb. So great to be together and so great to be comrades again.
Thank you. I share that view. It's wonderful to be connected.